All right, so for this next module, we're going to explore rendering using Lumion. Specifically, we're going to focus in on motion or a moving image. So we're going to take a look at making videos and things like that. To begin, the first thing we're going to do is just set up some material layers. So you'll see right now in this file, we have a series of assigned layers, but we have no assigned materials, which you could do manually by clicking here and starting to assign these. They do need to be separate materials when we bring it over into Lumion, because otherwise everything will just read as one material, and so we won't be able to differentiate between, say, the road and say the landscape area here, or even these planting areas that we have remnant from a previous tutorial. So what I would recommend, there's a really great command called synchronize render colors. So we can just go ahead and highlight everything here, and we'll say synchronize right here, synchronize render colors. We'll click, and so you'll notice here now all of our layer colors have transferred over to our material colors. Another way that I can show you that, if that's not making sense, would be I'll just hit undo and I'll go over into my rendered view, because this will give you a better sense of this is how it would read at the moment if we brought it over into Lumion. So everything is the same material. So once more, we'll highlight this and we'll say synchronize rendered colors, hit enter, and you can see now everything has that material color applied to it as well. So in rendered view and in shaded, it becomes the same. The only other thing that we'll do here is we're actually going to turn our vegetation off, and we're going to take this information here and we'll do export selected on this whole base model. One other tip is just make sure that you're actually at the origin point. So you're 0, 0, 0, and that this isn't geolocated somewhere else, because otherwise it'll appear as if you're not importing a file at all into Lumion. Once this is at your origin and you have your materials set up, you'll highlight it, file, export selected, and we're going to look for a collada file right here, and we'll go ahead and call this base. Now we can do the same with the vegetation, so I'll just turn the vegetation on, right click, select objects, and we'll go file, export selected, and we'll call this trees. The reason I'm exporting the trees separately is because we're going to be able to do a node replacement on those specifically, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. So let me go ahead and start up Lumion. And so here in Lumion, we'll go ahead and create new, and we'll stick with the base environment. Everything else here, because we're bringing in a landscape, we don't really need any of these other landscape types. We're actually bringing in our own, and everything off beyond that can just be flat. So plain environment. And so for this interface, just to move around, you can right click, and that'll change sort of as you scroll around your vantage point. You can hit W to go forward, D to go to one side, to the right that is, A to go to the left, and S to go backwards. So very much like a video game. And you can hit W and right click to start to move forward. And this will make a little bit more sense. I'll show it once we actually have something imported in here, since right now we're looking at just a kind of infinite landscape. Really quickly, most of what we're going to do today, there are layers here. So we'll work on layer 1 to import our base, and then I'll switch over to layer 2 to import the trees. So just remember that layers do exist, and you can actually rename them here. Base, and I'll call this trees. And you could even keep going, because we may want to add some people. It's nice to keep these organized in terms of turning it on and off. And so at the moment we're in our content library and we want to place something. So just make sure you go to place. From here, you'll go import new model, and we want to import that collada base file that we have, our .dae, and we'll hit open. So I'm just hitting the scroll wheel just to zoom out a little bit so you get a sense of how this landscape is importing. And at the moment, it's not placed yet, right? It's sort of in this kind of sticky toggle. And when I click, I've pasted it, but you'll notice there's still an option. I could be placing even more, right? So this is kind of stuck to an ongoing place function. I may just place 2 just for an example. So to get out of this, you'll go to select. And here you can see now that there are 2 options. There's this one, which I can move around, or there's this one, which I can move around. If I want to delete one, I can go to the delete key and just delete one of those. Now, what I would recommend is for this file, once you have it selected, you can see here the position. I would recommend just going ahead and getting this to a 0, 0, 0, something like this. Now, you may find in your site that your landscape is sunken in, kind of like this. If it's at the 0, in that case, you could just go plus 10 units, in this case, meters above. Now mine, it seems like at the 0, doesn't really fall into any more of the existing landscape. So I'm actually pretty good with my 0, 0, 0. So let me just scroll around a little bit. One thing that's worth mentioning is the layers, they're sort of sticky. So I actually imported this under people. So in this case, let's move that to base, and I'll go back to base so that we can actually draw on the base layer instead of the people layer. So for instance, if I go to trees and I turn visibility off, see now I can turn that base on and off. The reason the origin matters is because if I do want to import more information, such as those trees, I have to make sure I go over. So I'm on my tree layer now, and I'll go back to place, import new model, trees. Okay. And I can try to get it somewhat close. I'll just click there and I'll go to select. And so you can see those trees over here. They're not quite at the origin, right? And so that's why that matters, because now if I type in 0, 0, and 0, they're exactly where they are in the Rhino file. And so everything lines up the way it should. Really quickly, I just want to show why those tree files or instances, block instances matter, and that's because your file may look somewhat like this. If you click here on Show Advanced Options, you can actually replace objects on their nodes. So here, that'll be a node replacement, and I can select a tree here. These tree libraries, there's a whole bunch, and I'll show you how to get to these in a different way later when you're just sort of manually placing them rather than this kind of node replacement that I'm showing at the moment. You can see there's lots of trees, and you can also just go ahead and type something in, a birch tree, lots of different birches here, and you can see their relative size because there is a scale figure. So 3 pages of birches for us to choose from, and maybe I'll just go with this Japanese white birch. And there we are. So these are now all placed exactly where those nodes were, those blocks from our Rhino file. And we'll hit check. Let me zoom out a little bit. And so from here, what we can start to do is we can, of course, start to add other features. If we go to nature, that's where you'll find your trees. If nothing's coming up here for you, just make sure that you actually want to be placing trees, right? So right now I'm under select. So I can select these trees here. I can also hit Control and click down and select all of the trees at once. And I can start to randomize their size and things like that if we want to start to randomize a little bit these trees and their rotation and things like that, if it's looking a little bit too uniform for us compared to what it was before. So just know you do have those advanced features if you like. Let me close out of this. But if you want to place additional trees, you'll go to place and these trees will come in for you here. So lots of different options. Let's say you can look through a bunch of these. There's, let's see, 13 pages of broadleaf trees. You have conifers, palms, leafless trees, grasses, plants, flowers, some clusters if that's what you're interested in. I'll show you how to make custom clusters in a second. Leaves, forest, wood, rocks, weeds, and even some stylized trees, which I'll just show you for a sec. We zoom in. So what those look like. Kind of something more like what you might find in a ready-made Rhino file, these kinds of low poly trees, which you can move around. They sort of automatically snap to the landscape. I'm going to go ahead and delete these. Go back to place. And let's say I want to do some Alaska cedars. I'll go with this one. If you want a monoculture of Alaska cedars, you can actually place these a number of different ways. So one way would be to do a paint placement. And you can see the density here, so you can kind of go up and down with how dense these trees are. Sort of mid-range density, low density, and the highest density. So different densities of planting there, pretty powerful tool. And if you want to make a cluster of various types of trees, let me hit the check. So we're good there. We can do a cluster. And what's nice here is, we have this Alaska cedar, but we can also start to add trees at different maturity levels. So we could add this tree. We could also go ahead and start to add some broadleaf in as well. Maybe this one there. And let's just do sort of a strange combination of trees here. An Australian willow. So now we have 4 different tree types. Let me just scroll over here a little bit further away. And so you can see the cluster at the moment, they're right on top of each other. So we could start to increase the cluster range. So as I drag on this, you can see the spacing starts to increase. So that will be one cluster there. We can also begin to randomize their direction. So you can see them spinning. We can increase the number of trees within this cluster. And we can randomize their positions relative to one another as well here. And so that's how you can get a nice, let's go down on that, cluster range of various species of trees from a selected palette. So there's a different kind of forest in this area that starts to frame out this site that we've been kind of playing around with a little bit. There we go. And I'll just hit the check mark to get out of this. Now you can see I'm still in this kind of place environment. I can go over to select just to get out of that. And just remember, I'm still on my trees layer here. So these are, what's really nice here is if I kind of zoom out and take a look at this overall landscape that I've been populating. If I go over to my base file and I turn trees off, you can start to turn on and off your trees. I'll go over to base, and one thing that I'll show, I know in a previous demo I showed how I had set up a water plane actually in Rhino, but just know you can kind of set that up over here as well. We'll talk about materials in just a second, so how to start to use the Lumion materials to not have these stock Rhino ones. But just before that, I'd like to set my landscape. Specifically down here, I'm looking to set water. And so you can make a water plane, which I'm doing here by just dragging and pulling. Here's that endpoint. And so you can kind of just snap that to however you like. Let me just scroll over here a little bit. One little trick that you can do is if you double click the right mouse button, you can kind of get across this landscape in quicker fashion. So if you're holding the W key and you right click twice, you can kind of go faster. And that's good to know for when you have these larger landscape moments. So the other thing that you might be thinking is this water, if you know the Seattle area, this does not look quite like the water near gasworks. So you can start to swap out for a little bit more like a pond water that we have there. So if I zoom in, you'll get a better sense of how that kind of looks. So that's our pond water. And you could also start to move this up and down, start to get a sense of actually how this landscape would flood. So let's just leave it right around there for now. And why don't we go ahead and set some materials in this landscape. So I'll go over to this paintbrush, the materials side. And now you can see all of these materials are separate. So we can start to select these and go through our materials. If we go to landscape, we can set asphalt treatment for the road. We can go over to our grass here, and we could set 2D or 3D grasses. So here's some grasses. They look fairly tiled. These are just kind of preview images, as you get more into this landscape. Or if we were to render this out, it wouldn't look as tiled, but this is just what that looks like on the ground, just to give you a sense. So lots of options here for the grass. The 3D grass is quite nice, but it can be a little bit heavy as well. So this is wild grass 3D. So especially when you get to the edge, you get this nice moment, the overgrown. So wild grass 1. Okay, so let me zoom out a little bit. So if we're happy with that grass, we can go a couple other materials. Let's set these context buildings. We may want them to just be a plaster. Maybe it's a base stucco finish, something that's somewhat unassuming. It's just context for us. Whereas these buildings here, we may want to have a little more prominent. Maybe it is a kind of aged steel. Could see if we have a rust option. Let's try here. So we do have some rust. So rusty metal. Let's zoom in. Again, it doesn't look great when you're that far away. So that tile is not that nice. Could just use a more uniform version like this, where it won't read as tiled. And let's go in and we can add some more landscape options here. Maybe this lawn, we go back, and this could be a more kind of mown lawn, something like that. Can also go and add things like leaves if we have more like a ground cover kind of landscape. So here I'll zoom in. So this would be a kind of like ivy or something playing off of potentially the rust of that landscape. And over here, what we could do is we could also start to play around with different landscape materials, different stones. So we could have a kind of stone finish. If we go to our materials, we close out of rust, and we go to stone, you can actually find bricks and things underneath here, or even cobbles. So you can start to make very nice cobble patterns. And this is kind of important because, we just went over a generative design module where we were starting to try to design these things in Rhino, these different patterns. But here they're just textures, so they're quite a lot lighter. I can go to brick, and you can look at some of the brick patterning as well here. And again, 3 pages of that, depending on what you're looking for. So let's go ahead and we'll stick with something that's kind of still in this red kind of style. We have ground cover, the red brick, and the kind of rust building. So you can go in and change the settings on this as well. So you could actually play around a little bit with the roughness of this image. You can play around with the scale of the brick, their relative relief. Some of these you won't sort of read quite in the same way. So here's the offset between them. You can maybe vaguely read that in the recording of this, but that scale can change. And so we'll go back. We'll just zoom out a little bit here just to get a sense of this overall landscape that we're at. And we'll hit the check mark there. So additionally here, one other thing that I'm realizing might be good to show is if we go back to content library. And one thing I didn't touch on is when we're placing trees, the one I didn't talk about is line placement. So for our tree placement, let's go back to birch, see if we can find like a multi-stem birch or something. All right, right here. So let's say I wanted to place a bunch of multi-stem birches here within my plaza. I could go ahead and do a line placement. And we could do this with 2 species, and then I'll show you what it's like with 1. So here's the 2 different species, different heights. So you can change the number of trees along this line segment. You can play around with their direction. You can actually also offset them off of that line, randomize their spacing as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete out that. So we actually just have a monoculture planting here of these trees. And let's say we're happy with that. We'll just hit the check mark, and we could do that again. So it could be more like a kind of grove. Could go with the same amount or less and start to change their directions and things like that too. So that's just another tool for planting in a bit more of an organized way. And we could, let me go back, just add some rocks and things as well into this landscape. Fairly large here. And so some of those trees now are a little bit more organized, and some within the context are a little bit more wild. From here, there's just a couple more. I may just go back to my materials, and I'll just select this and just make this a different kind of asphalt. Maybe it's a little bit darker. Hit the check. So now we have full landscape. The next thing we'll want to do just before we start to demo some of the film options is add some people to this area. So let me just go ahead and go back to my content library, and we'll go to people and animals, and we'll go back to place. We're going to want to move these people during the scene. So just so you know, there are people 3D static, which you can see here. If you place those, they're not actually going to move around. So make sure you use 3D people here. And we can go ahead and just like before, you could create a line placement with multiple people. So you can make a whole kind of collection of people or place them individually. If we have a couple different cyclists that we would want to add, go back. Here we go. So two different kinds of cyclists at the moment that maybe we want to just put along this path. And let's lower the amount. So just a crew like that. Let's switch their direction. We want them going into this landscape, and we'll hit OK. So that's kind of a group of cyclists. And then we could also put a bunch of people in this kind of plaza space. So why don't we go ahead and do that? We'll do a cluster placement. We'll have this person here, a couple more people here. So you'll notice I'm just choosing all people that are walking. There's lots of different pages here, and I'm always going to the one that says walk. Let's go back. Okay, so I've set a group here. You can see they're all somewhat close together at the moment here. What I would recommend is you just start to increase that cluster range for yourself so that they're a little more spaced out. There we are, something like that. And we'll hit the check mark. Let me go ahead and just talk a little bit about the colorize option. So here, if you go to colorize, you can actually start to swap out some of the people here. When you zoom in, you know, they are computer graphics. So it may not look exactly like that, an aesthetic that you want. Here we have the computer graphic people. But if you colorize it, you know, you can get into silhouette options and you can kind of customize the silhouette color in this case. So the traditional sort of black silhouette or white silhouette, or a custom color depending on how you kind of want to render this out. And you'll notice that changes for everyone in this scene and there. So I'll just go ahead and keep that as it is. And let me go ahead and place, there's another 3D silhouette things. So here you can have someone flying a kite, which is always kind of a nice aesthetic in the drawing space. So if you go like this, and we can move that just a little further away. So now we've set some people, and that'll be important for us as we start to move through this landscape. You can start to play around with the sun and like the overall weather in this landscape even here. So let me go down to the ground a little bit more. But mostly what we want to do in this case is we actually want to play around with the sun in our movie view rather than just in our model view. So once you're happy with how you have this set up, we'll go over into movie. And if you do want to go back to your build area, just know you can go back to build. You can also render images here, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. So build to get back to this space, and in this case, movie. Now I'll show both versions, a record version as well as preset cameras, but we'll start with record. And in this example, maybe we'll start with something that begins fairly zoomed out. Now I'm going to be extra careful to not show the extents beyond my landscape. So I'm just going to do something like this. And here what you can do is you just add your first view. So this is where the recording will start, right there. And then I could zoom in, say, to here, a view like this, and that'll be my second view. And then maybe my third view is here. Fourth view could be here. And let's do like a fifth view here, behind the cyclist. And then maybe we actually want to pan somewhat up again in the view here. So you can see we have 26 seconds set here, and I can hit play. Now what I'm noticing is it does pull beyond. We can maybe fix that with some atmospherics. But as you can see, this starts to follow a full path. And starts to provide us with an overview. So if I want to, for instance, cut my scene here, I could just delete, pause. I can just delete this last keyframe. And so now the clip you'll see 22 seconds. So essentially does exactly the same thing, but you'll see now the scene will end with us at the cyclist. You can speed this up by decreasing the amount of time. So if I want that whole thing to go in 5 seconds, you can see that's a lot quicker, right? And in turn, we could also slow this down. So as we increase the time, the camera will move through this landscape slower. And that's what you're seeing here now. So let's go ahead and save this clip. And when you're going through these, I would recommend having smaller clips, essentially. And so that would be an opportunity for you to start to copy the clip and then paste the clip. And so now in this clip, if you go over and you edit the clip, we could actually start to delete scenes. And so this scene could actually start where the last one stopped, right? So we're here, that's our first scene. And now I could say, let's go to here. And so here, what we could actually do is, even if we want to just manually pan up from here, we could just move the camera up and take a new frame. So now this will essentially go from this scene, pan in a little bit, and then it'll actually just go up for us. And then from this one, say we want to orbit and zoom out a little bit and look over like that. That could be our last scene. So let's try that out. See it in full. So from the bike, going in, stopping, moving up, and starting to kind of orbit outwards. So we'll hit check. And I would recommend working with multiple clips within this overall rendered movie, because if you have like a mistake from one to the other, the rendering time for you to go in and redo a part of a scene versus the whole thing is going to be a lot shorter, right? If you have multiple small clips that you have to re-render versus one super large one. It also allows you to start to edit different kinds of atmospheres. So you can see, for instance, if we go back to clip 1, you could start to add effects here. And so you can do things like ray tracing. Go back and we'll add effects. So things like more conceptual styles, like your sketching or pastel sketching. If I click on that, it's not going to work. One is blocked by the other. So you do have to turn ray tracing off to get your sketch aesthetic on. And if you click on that, you can start to make it more or less accurate and change the style. And so you could have a whole kind of scene that looks like this in more of a sketch style, highly stylized and less realistic looking, I guess, if you will. And so if you like that style, you could go back and add other effects. So one thing we may want to start to play around with here is, it could be raining. And so you can start to play around with the precipitation setting, so how much rain there is. I may go and turn sketch off just so you can see this a bit better. And let's do ray tracing on. So certain things like precipitation can increase the particle size here. So you'll see there's a lot more legible rain, and it can be quite dramatic like this. And again, the phase, so wet to dry, this kind of thing, in terms of how much the landscape is flooding. And you can actually also go from rain towards snow. So you can see that here. So you could have a landscape that starts off with just a bit of snow, and by the time we go to our next scene over here, it could actually take you into a fully snow scene. So let's take a look here. This is a heavy snow scene now. Okay, so we'll hit pause on that. Let's say we really want to up the atmosphere and we can add some fog. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so I'm choosing on purpose to really play up these atmospheres, and that's really just to make it legible. You can go here and copy the effect list, and so if you go over to your next scene, you can just paste the effect list, and that'll give you exactly the same scene. So now this will pick up with the same landscape condition as before, just like that. From here, you could start to increase the amount, say, of snow, right? So it could be that there's quite a lot more snow at this point. And so you'd go from this initial scene to something where the amount of snow down here has accumulated. You're seeing that on the stones and things like that, as well as the trees. So a couple of other things, if we want some of these characters to move, especially, I mean, we could do it in the first scene. They may be kind of hard to see here. So why don't we give it a shot here? We could also go in and start to add a little bit more sky or something like that and play around with the lighting. So we could go in and start to add a different sun condition. So within this sort of crazy scene, we can also start to have a lot more dramatic sun, really nice shadowing on the trees, on this silo. And so let's say in the scene we want to start to move people around. What you can do for that is you go into animation, and just to begin, I'll do a move example here, and you just want to hit edit, And we'll zoom out a little bit. So there's two different parts. You can choose within your overall scene at what point you want the people to start to move. Now, I would want them to start to move at the very beginning, and that's because in our scene, we begin right here behind the cyclist. So if we want the cyclist to move through the scene, you can do a start position here, and let's go ahead and set an end position right there. So you can see that cyclist starting to move through that landscape along that vector. Now another option would be, because we have multiple cyclists, let me hit cancel changes on this. It could be that it makes more sense for us to start to move a character here, a singular character. And so let me see, what if our start position is here for this character at the 0 second mark? So it's a kind of reverse order now. The person's walking. Let's rotate them. And so there, just a slow walk through the scene. We'll hit OK. That looks pretty good to us. And let's go back, and I'll just show you the mass movement option as well. So we'll go to mass movement, edit, and the mass movement, let's say I want these 3 cyclists to go through my landscape. You can click, hold down. Now, if you hold Control, you can add additional sequences here. So we could have them start to navigate the boulders. So it's not just a straight line, and go through just like this. And you can increase the width to try and get as many characters into this as you can. So this, in this case, would be the 3. And let's preview that. And so now, yeah, all 3 cyclists will kind of follow this path through the whole scene at the current speed that they're set at. So that's 3 kilometers, and they'll just loop. So we could actually speed them up a little bit. So there they are, going a little bit faster. 21. That's pretty fast. So there, that seems not so bad. Maybe we'll have them go around 15. And we'll hit check. And so now we can play this scene. So just a couple more things in the build area that we could start to talk through, which would be just some additional effects. If we go to place, you can have fire. We could, for whatever reason, start to play in some large flames on either side. We could have some smoke. We can have a little additional foggy area. There's already fog in our scene, but let's just play around with that. Or even things like flying leaves. And at this point, I'm really just going to try and show you a broad array of different kinds of features, such as maybe there is a water feature here. This is more like a waterfall, but you can see some other options. So there, let's go back to our movie and let's start it here so you can see the flames and things like that off in the distance. So that's our first scene. Here's our second. I'll just go ahead and showcase one more camera option. So I've shown you the record option, but you could also play around a little bit with some of these settings. Let me zoom out a little bit. So we have this orbit option. Let's just do this. So we'll kind of orbit around these trees or something like that. You can see the camera height here. So keep in mind, this is relative to the full 0 being the ground. So let me just hit check on that and let's hit play. So this, of course, is quite nice for, especially if you have a piece of architecture or sculpture that you want to orbit around. Again, remember, you can copy or paste a clip. Once you have this clip, you can also still paste the effects like we had before. So now I have the same scene, but within that snow scene as I had in the last one. Or of course, you can start to remove your scenes so that maybe it's just fog in this case. So that's one option. And then let me set another scene and we'll just do a dolly pass to end. So if we go to our dolly shot and we want to go just across this landscape from the field through this kind of alley of trees. Let's hit OK. So it looks like we're right at the ground at the moment, and the camera's facing a different direction. So let's hit edit clip. So let's try 8 meters here and here. There, that looks a bit better. We can see the camera is actually up quite a lot higher, as you can see here. And let's say we want to tilt the camera, right? So we actually want it to go past the trees in this direction. Let me just zoom in just so you can see that a bit more clearly. So it points where the camera is, so we can switch our heading. Before we had it just going along a path, but now we could do it more of a traditional dolly shot. And you can play around a little bit with the pitch, right? In terms of is it looking down or up. So this is a little bit higher than eye level. You can kind of see that here. So let's try this at 6 and 6 and hit OK. And here we could go ahead and go back to this scene. Let's say we want this same style. Go here, copy effect list, and then you can just go ahead and paste that in here. Okay, and let's hit play. So a nice dolly shot through that landscape with all the strange features. All right, so that's more or less how you set this up. So now we have 4 different clips, different moments, and types of atmosphere, as well as types of renderings. If you're going to render the movie, you can hit render. You have a choice here of frames per second. So just keep in mind, the more frames per second, the longer the render time. The other thing is you can increase or decrease your production output. So in this case, are you doing draft, good, production quality? You can also select which clips you would like to actually do. So in this case, if I just want to render 1 out, I can go ahead and just do 1. Make sure you set the same frames per second for each one, and then you can just go ahead and render these out. And so we could just do a render HQ. Let me do one of the shorter ones here, just in the interest of time, and HD, just to give you a sense of how long this will take. So this shorter one will still take about 5-6 minutes. But in any case, I think this kind of can close out the tutorial on how to render in motion using Lumion. And we'll circle back just with some other options. I'm going to go ahead and render out a bunch of these, and in a future module to just talk a little bit about how to edit these together using Adobe After Effects, and we'll kind of go from there.